Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to our hour-long end of August special Scary Stories NYC. I'm Henry Lee Dogman, filling in for your old pal Bigfoot. I'd like to kick this episode off with a story about one of the most frightening ideas about us dogmen. That the reason you people never find our bones is that we aren't from your reality. What if we have the power to come into your dimension, scare you all out of your wits, then, when you all grab your torches and pitchforks and come out in the forest to get back at us, we just wiggle our canine noses like Samantha from Bewitched and blink out of your world and go back into the Dogman Dimension Doorway. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm new to all this Dogman stuff, although I'm no spring chicken. I retired last year from my job and actually am receiving a pension like people from the 20th century used to. I've got all this free time, and I've been exploring YouTube. I was listening to podcasts about the so-called Skinwalker Ranch, and eventually found my way to the Dogman stories on your channel, and a few others like Venomous Fringe. The reason I find this subject so interesting is that it causes me to flash back on a family story I was told a couple of times when I was a kid. According to the legend, my father's grandfather's generation of the family lived out west on either a farm or a ranch that was occasionally haunted by werewolf-like entities. My father told me the story once, and his sister, my Aunt Bertha, not her real name, told a somewhat different version to me at my father's funeral years later. Let me tell you my father's version first, because to me, that was the only version for all of my younger days. According to what Dad had been told, or what he remembered, when his own father was young, his family lived on a farm haunted by dogmen and other scary things. On 2 different occasions, men had supposedly literally disappeared. One of them came back, and I'll get to what he claimed happened to him later. All these stories were my father telling me things his father had told him about when he was very young. Supposedly, my family lost the farm when my grandfather was 10 years old, so I suppose we should take into account that these are the memories of someone thinking back to his childhood, and that the stories have been retold for generations and never written down before. The first sign that something was odd at the farm was that the family members and workers kept complaining that at dawn or at dusk, the fringes of the property were haunted by these chimera creatures. They seemed to be 2 different kinds of animals mixed together, and the most frequently cited one was the half-man, half-wolf creature that stood upright and walked on its hind legs. This was the most feared, and it was becoming hard to keep good workers because of it. They kept leaving out of a feeling of being very unsafe. That situation and reputation for the farm got a whole lot worse when one of the brothers in the family went missing and never returned. There was a story going around that the others could hear him calling to them, but they couldn't see him anywhere. The family searched the area for days, thinking that maybe he had fallen into a hole or a crevice and been hidden from view. By the time they began searching, though, the sound of his cries had long since ceased. The business began to be in trouble as they had lost a good worker in that brother who disappeared, and the morale of the workers in general was at an all-time low. that's when a situation happened that even in the legend itself was considered very controversial. That was the second disappearance on the farm. One of the workers who had been with the family the longest, let's call him Ernest, disappeared without a trace one day, same as the brother had previously. This guy walked off from one location and people saw him leave, but nobody saw him arrive at the next place he was supposed to be. A search was launched, but nothing turned up. No evidence at all surfaced that might hint as to where he had gone. The next day, the remaining workers were meeting with the family and announcing that they would be resigning their posts, when in walked Ernest, right in the middle of the meeting, and he had a wild tale to tell, a tale that involved Dogman. According to the legend, Ernest was walking to his next post, and he saw a bird flying low zoom past him from behind. In front, his eyes saw the bird fly into what appeared to be a vertical level of clear water emerging out of the ground and going straight up. The bird entering the invisible water wall caused a ripple in the surface, and Ernest watched the reality past it flutter. He walked closer and stuck his hand out into the wall to see if he too could make the reality there ripple. As his fingers entered the nearly invisible barrier, his entire field of perception was sucked onto the other side. Ernest said that he was at once both still at the farm and yet no longer there. The sky was now dark like night, and yet had so much purple in its coloring that he thought it might be the end of sunset or the beginning of dawn. Although as dark as night, he could still make out great detail in his surroundings. Ernest claimed he recognized much of the landscape, but there were trees with purple flowers that he had never seen before. He wandered toward the woods, and in the distance, he saw what he described as strange glowing lights, illuminating the dark interior of the forest with bright, unnatural colors, the like of which he had never seen before. The lights frightened him, and he felt so curious that he took a few steps toward the forest, wondering what could be causing such an effect. At that point, he saw a hunting pack of upright walking dog-man chimeras emerge from the forest. He saw 2, then 3, then 5, and that was enough. He turned to run back to find the invisible watery wall and get back to his own reality. Behind him, more and more dog-headed, feral men ran out of the strange forest, chasing him. Ernest said the creatures looked just like the descriptions that others had given in their alleged sightings. These were giant-sized men, 7 or 8 feet tall depending on the description. They were covered in very dark, or else black, fur, shaggy and messy all over. They carried on their faces an expression of utter fury and indignance. Their eyes exhibited eye shine in the darkness, which gave them an even more otherworldly feel. Although retaining a very canine quality and shape to the body, with thin waist leading up to a wide chest, the Dogman also had strong-looking human-like arms, ending in hand-like paws, with relatively long articulated fingers, claws, and an opposable thumb. I could swear he said something at one point about them throwing stuff, so these were more men than dogs from the sound of it. But the heads were certainly very canine in appearance. Utterly and uniformly dark-furred, the huge dog-shaped men must have been terrible to see. The thought of encountering a world with roaming packs of them would seem a nightmare to me. Creatures of absolute evil, not something that nature would normally produce. Anger and hunger collected together to create a kind of a life form. The unforgiving nature of what chased Ernest is what fueled his legs to stay ahead of the pack. He knew this might be the last race of his life. According to Ernest, he reached the spot he thought the wall was at, but experienced nothing out of the ordinary. Behind him, the Dogmen were fast approaching. He wandered for a while but realized the wall was gone. Out of fear of the approaching Dogman, Ernest reluctantly left that spot and ran. If he couldn't get back to his own reality, maybe he could still try to stay alive in this Dogman dimension. At some point during his run, Ernest quite accidentally ran back through the watery wall into this reality. Although only a few minutes had passed for him, over a day had passed here. His return caused some of the workers to agree to stay at their jobs, but his description of the terrifying Dogman dimension was enough to cause some of the others to quit. After a while, suspicion grew among the workers that Ernest might have made up the story at the behest of the owners, and the situation on the job became increasingly paranoid and stressed out. Hard times got harder for the family and the farm as they continually were forced to work with a skeleton crew due to the reputation that the place had gotten of being haunted and dangerous. There were also stories of fairies that would spirit people away, but I wasn't as interested in those. I mainly remember the parts about the Dogman and the other reality he was supposed to come from. Now, in the version my father told, this all occurred in Utah on a farm. After Dad passed, as I said, I got an earful at his funeral from his sister, my Aunt Bertha. In her version, this did not happen on a farm in Utah. It happened on a ranch in Wyoming. And also in her version, the nature of the Dogman reality was different than ours in several key ways. First of all, the Dogman in that reality had glowing red orbs for eyes. Secondly, everything appeared warped, as though viewed underwater in some way. The colors were all different too, although Ernest still thought of them by the same names he thought of them here. He was at a loss to describe how strange everything was, but still, in this version of the story by Aunt Bertha, the ranch was there on that other side, in the Dogman dimension. It was a weirdly colored version of our reality that had Dogman on top of the food chain instead of us. Another difference was that in her story, it was a cattle ranch, and she told some pretty gory stories about the Dogman and the cattle that I'm not going to get into in this venue. Aunt Bertha and I actually made it a hobby of ours for the next year and a half to research into our family history and see if we could prove or disprove any of this. We never were even able to establish anything to prove the existence of our family before my father's birth certificate and my grandfather's purchase of a home in 1962. Either we're searching under the wrong last name, or wherever we lived might have had its records destroyed in the past somehow. Before we could prove or disprove these stories, we'd somehow have to prove or disprove that we have any ancestors at all in a sense. At any rate, if it's just a collection of fish stories, at least it's a weird and unique one. Because of these family legends, I've always, from when I was a kid, wondered about everything around me, instead of just assuming I already know what it is. Could something like this actually explain why, people keep saying they see dogmen while we never find any physical evidence of the existence of these creatures? Could they, in fact, only be visiting here from their home on the other side of the Dogman Dimensional Doorway? We'll be right back with another all-new Dogman story right after this.
Hey there, do you like werewolf stories? Then join me, Nancy Livonian in Hollywood, every week for Werewolf Wednesdays right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel. See you next Wednesday.
The Little River Dogman. In southeastern Oklahoma, just west of Arkansas and north of Texas, there's a place known as the Little River National Wildlife Refuge. Little did I know that my seemingly insignificant decision to go hiking in the area by that refuge would lead to my encountering a creature lost in space and time. A creature that could have taken my life from me if I had been less lucky. A creature which these days, decades later, many of us refer to as the Dogman. So, this was the 1960s when I was still a teenager. I was visiting the Little River area with my two cousins who had been there before, and I got talked into taking a ride in a rowboat down the Little River. I felt unwell in the boat and couldn't row. We pulled over to the side of the river, and my cousins noticed a path into the woods near where we had landed the boat. After I felt better, they talked me into hiking for a while down the path to see what we could see down there. They reasoned that the path led right back to our boat, so we'd be able to row back to our starting point after our hike was done. I was still feeling a bit out of it, but I didn't want to be a downer, so I agreed, and off we went, deeper into the wilderness than I really felt safe going on that particular day. The sun beat down, the weather was hot, and it added to my disorientation. I asked my cousins if we could go back, that it was going to start to get dark soon. They told me if we walked back when it was darker, it would also be cooler. I said, if we walked back in the dark, we might get lost, and they both made fun of me that there was only one dirt path in those woods. It wasn't like there were 20 turnoffs where we might get confused. We only had to walk on this one path, and that would lead us right back to our boat. A moment later, the entire point was made moot as we heard the howling sound of a very large canine predator behind us, soon joined with calls from great distances in nearly every direction. We all froze. I could see the fear on my cousins' faces. One of them said something about how it was just some old dog, but I could see the frightened expression on his face, and I knew he was as scared as I was. The thing is, that howl came back from the direction of our boat. Now we had little choice but to keep heading away from it, to keep getting lost further and deeper into the woods. Although our situation was now far worse, we had no more reason to argue with each other. We all sped up our walking, and the night grew darker. We could hear something large pursuing us. It didn't sound like a pack of dogs. It sounded more like a bear. But we had heard the howl, and bears don't sound like that. So, logically, we must have been being chased by a large dog. It sounded heavy, and it sounded strong. I could hear branches cracking to get out of its way, that sounded like they were pretty thick. They also sounded as though they were pretty far up into the trees. I couldn't visualize what might be after us. There was no such animal as what that sounded as though it were. I had a good chance to listen to it too, since none of the three of us were daring to say another word. We were trying to be as silent as we could and as fast as we could. We wanted to put distance between us and whatever that was behind us, but it was just not happening. The thing was either keeping pace, or possibly it was even advancing on us, getting closer. We just kept trying to move more quickly, and our actions became increasingly more streamlined for the sake of necessity. At this point, I heard water from in front of us, running water. We had come out of the trees, and there it was. The little river. The water we had paddled here on. It shouldn't have been there. It should have been directly behind us. We should have been heading far away from it. And yet, there was no sign of our boat here anywhere. This was so shocking and surreal that I literally wondered if I were dreaming. I had heard that you can tell if you're dreaming by doing math. If you can, then you're awake. I added 16 with 16, and I got 32. I divided 52 by 4, and got 13. It seemed as though I could do math, unless that was another illusion and another part of my dream. After all, how could I know if my math were correct if I were dreaming? Maybe I'd laugh at those numbers when I woke up, if I even remembered them. I was beginning to get frantic. I wanted this to be a dream, when I heard one of my cousins cry out softly, in a horrified voice. He was looking behind us, down the path toward where we had just run from. There was a man there. Only it wasn't a man. It was the sickest part of this dream I was having, I'll tell you that. This was like an 8-foot tall man, but it was also like a big dog, reared back on its hind legs and walking right toward us. This thing had glowing eyes like you'd expect on a robot, but it was drooling, smelly, and it was whining in a stressed way, as though it were very biological and very real indeed. But it couldn't be real. Its face had an insane expression on it that shouldn't exist in nature. Its teeth were ridiculously long. Its eyes were like lightning bugs. My heart beat so fast, I was afraid I would die from the fear. So I tried to breathe more slowly, and I tried to think. I failed utterly, incapable of thinking when I saw my cousins dive into the water and swim to the opposite shore. I did as well. It was all lizard brain taking over because my conscious mind was in a bit of shock. We made it ashore and ran into the woods on the other side, panting and crying. I could see a flashlight moving in the darkness ahead of us, and I heard a man's voice shouting to us to slow down. It was soon joined by a female voice, and it turned out an old couple were flagging us down. They comforted us and asked us what had happened. We told them as they led us back to their camp. They explained to us that we hadn't just swum across the little river. We had swum across Crooked Creek, north of the river. They packed us in blankets in their tent and told us they'd guide us back to our boat in the morning and that we should sleep in the meantime. The two of them stayed outside by their fire and guarded us all night. In the morning, They said they had heard something moving around in the darkness, but had no idea if it was the predator that had chased us, or a deer, or anything else. They shared their breakfast with us, and we hiked until we found our boat and the little river. We thanked them, and they walked on back into Dogman territory. I wished them luck. That experience sent my life in a different direction. I had been kind of average up until then, but after that, I became weird. I was afraid of the forest. I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of monsters, and I was timid. On the other hand, I became a voracious reader, and my grades improved greatly at school. I spent most of my life working in a library in a big city where I got to read every scary book I could lay my hands on. Even now, in my retirement, I continue to live in the city and I travel by public transportation. I never went hiking again. I never went to a nature reserve again. I never got a driver's license because it would increase the risk of me getting a flat tire in the middle of the woods where the Dogman could find me again. You see, even in my old age, I'm still as interested in Dogman as I ever was. The thing is, I absolutely never want to take any chance at all that I could possibly meet him ever again. I've got a really scary double-length story this time about a person who claims he once found Dogman existing under the surface of the earth. We've had a number of stories before about Dogman living in cave systems and coming up to the surface to hunt. This story is a bit different. In this one, the Dogmen are alleged to live within the boundaries of human civilization, but down in the sewer system. Such a thing couldn't possibly be real. Or could it? Join us now and we'll relate to you the tale of the werewolf in the sewer system. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a kid, we moved around a lot. My father couldn't keep a job, but he kept getting new ones, and sometimes my mother would take me and leave him to live with her. She couldn't keep a job either, and so we kept moving until she'd get back with him. Then we'd move a few more times before she left him, so that we could move a few more times. That's about all I remember from my childhood. Since this was back in the 1970s, before the internet, I had no way to really make or keep friends, except in the short term. I also would forget my way to school and forget the name of the town I was living in. For these reasons, I don't even remember where the story I'm about to tell you took place, but it was in the United States, in a really nice, quiet, lower middle class, working class town, in the summer during the 1970s. An idyllic setting, and yet one in which I encountered horror in the form of the Dogman. I had heard stories going back into my childhood about there being alligators living in the New York City sewer system. I always wondered about them, and I would ask questions about the sewer systems of wherever we moved to. I was a weird kid. There was an old silent movie on PBS that had these amazing looking sets that were supposedly the sewer system of Paris. I think it might have been Phantom of the Opera that I was watching. It made me even more curious about what was hidden underneath all of us. After we moved to whatever Beaver Cleaver town this was, I remember walking around at lunch with some loser kids, desperate enough to let the new guy join their social group. I remember asking about the sewers, and one of the boys going on and on about how there was a werewolf in their local sewer. I was stunned. and fascinated as he told me friend of a friend story after friend of a friend story about kids seeing dog-headed men staring at them from the drain openings on the corners of the blocks, just like that clown in It. I don't know if that was even written yet, but it's probably some kind of archetypal fear. If you stare into the darkness, what if someone or something stares back? I asked question after question, and he told me of a way to get into the system to see the werewolf. It was a bit of a walk out of town, but the school was closer to it than my home was, so I decided to walk there once classes ended that very day. I asked the others if they wanted to come with me, but they all cited other plans. It was pretty exciting, I have to say, to finally be investigating a real-life sewer. I had been reading about them and thinking about them for so long. I was now going to get some real-life experience to compare my fantasies to. And to think that this one was alleged to have a werewolf-type creature in it made this, without a doubt, the coolest location I had ever set out for. To me, at that point, monsters were like superhero comic books or baseball cards. I tried to collect as many of these things as I could. I wanted to see every monster movie. I wanted to read every monster book. I understood the difference between movie monsters like Godzilla and allegedly real-life monsters such as Bigfoot, but I seriously did not care about the differences. I just wanted to collect all merch and all information about each of them. This was the first time I would be going to a location alleged to house a life monster, and so to me, this was an event like going to Corvettes to get Spider-Man's autograph. I wasn't thinking ahead. I never asked myself what I would do if I saw an actual werewolf in the sewer. He probably wouldn't be there signing autographs, and he probably wouldn't appreciate me showing up in his home, cramping his style. But I had a big smile on my face, and I was naively certain that this was going to be the most fun ever. I reached the circular entrance to the sewer system, which had water trickling out of it at the bottom. My sneakers were going to get wet, but it was going to be worth it. I stepped in, feeling like Neil Armstrong on the moon. Every part of me was sizzling with excitement and wonder. I splish-splashed around the edge of the water and chose a dark tunnel to walk down. I hadn't brought a flashlight with me, so I was going to be limited by only going down tunnels I could at least see dimly in. Once I ran out of those, I decided I would turn around and call it a day. Then, next time, I would make different choices and maybe bring a flashlight too. I had a plan for how to do this sort of thing that I had been thinking about for years, but had never before had a chance to put it into action. I reached another intersection in the tunneling and noticed that one of the tunnels was pitch black after a way, while the other seemed pretty well lit. Making the obvious choice, I discovered that this tunnel went under a street because there were manhole covers up top at regular intervals. They lit up my passage and offered me a means of escape in case of emergency, so they were a very welcome sight. I hadn't seen anything to really frighten me yet, but the further I went, I knew the more likely it became that something weird or possibly dangerous might happen. By the way, you should never do what I did that day, even if you're an adult. This was a long time ago, and we kids were much more naive than these days. This is a story from another time. The tunnels down there are not pleasant smelling. I noticed that after the first turn I took, they got progressively more foul as you proceed. I entered a well-lit tunnel with manhole covers and gratings, allowing plenty of sunlight in. But there was an odor down there that was absolutely sickening. I almost turned back, it was that bad. Instead, I decided to lift part of my t-shirt up over my nose and try to breathe through my mouth. I walked more carefully now, wanting to be sure what I was stepping down on before making each step. There had to be a reason for the intensity of this bad smell, and I didn't want to get any more of it on myself than I needed to. So I turned a corner from this better lit tunnel into a less well-lit alcove, and I looked up to see only one light source, a corner drain, and a shaft of sunlight was coming down that drain, illuminating a figure standing there, staring back up at it. I was witnessing all this in silhouette, and the figure did not appear to notice me. Stunned and transfixed by the silent and motionless scene, I studied it for the purposes of future memory. My classmates would want to hear about this, most certainly. Why? Because what I was looking at could definitely fit the description of the werewolf I was supposed to see if I came down into these tunnels. This was a gray, wolf-like creature, but it was standing upright. I don't mean like a meerkat poking itself up so it can see further away. I mean, this was a wolf that was standing fully tall on its hind legs, with both of them fully extended in a way similar to how a man would stand. This was not an animal doing a trick. This was an animal standing the way it naturally stood. Given that wolf-headed creatures are generally four-legged creatures, that marked this one as an exception to the rule. Although he was not wearing a lumberjack shirt and would not have responded if I called out the name of Mr. Cheney, I would think that it might be fair to call what I was staring at a werewolf, at least by the standards of most people of the 1970s. And the amazing thing was that he was in fact staring out of a corner drain, just like the kid in school had told me he'd been sighted doing. Remember, as I said, this was years before Stephen King wrote It, as far as I know. The head was like a wolf, but its face was darker than the rest of its fur. In that sense, it was sort of like a Great Dane. The ears were upright and basically triangular like a wolf, and its eyes were transfixed on whatever it was that it was seeing outside the grating up there. It reminded me of a cat when it's hunting, and it can go completely silent, studying its intended prey. But this was not a cat in any way. It was most definitely canine. It was just a canine that stood on its hind legs. There were other differences between this creature and your average dog or wolf. Besides its upright posture, though, the thing had arms that, although it held them in front the way a dog might when sitting up, had shoulder muscles and arms far more like those of a human than those of a dog. I guess in that sense, it kind of looked like a guy wearing a dog suit. Except, once you got past its torso, those hind legs looked really very much like dog legs, only thicker and more massive, because they were intended to lift more weight, I suppose. The only motion at all from the creature was that I could see it was breathing lightly, and its chest was heaving ever so slightly on a regular rhythm. As I noticed this, I saw that the fingers on its hands would sort of stretch and wiggle every so often. That was when it registered in my brain. Wolves and dogs don't have fingers. They only have paws. But this thing looked perfectly natural standing there, wiggling the fingers on its hands as though it were practicing or preparing to snatch someone from the above world down into the world of darkness we were inhabiting together. In the movies, when monsters would do things like that, I would always identify with them. They were the outsiders. They were the misunderstood ones, and so I was on their side. Down there in the sewer, standing just a few feet from a real-life monster, it dawned on me that monsters were not going to like me just because I liked them in the movies. Monsters were not my friends. Monsters, in all likelihood, were waiting in the shadows for their chance to pull me down to their level and undo everything my parents and I had ever done. I had been taught about working a little bit every day toward building a future. Well, this dogman in front of me could undo all of it with one swipe from his terrifying-looking clawed hands. In the dim light, I was confused about some of what I was seeing. The dogman appeared to have a very long tail, folded up behind him on a ledge on the side of the drainage tunnel. Then, I saw the tail move in a way it shouldn't have been able to, and to my horror, I saw another dog head rise out of it. I gasped in shock, and that head turned quickly to stare directly at me. It was not the tail of a large dogman. It was another dogman, and it had been sleeping or resting on that ledge. Now fully awakened by the sight of me, the smaller one reared back and came to a fully standing position on the ledge. The monster I had seen originally now slowly turned its gaze from looking out of the grating toward looking directly into my eyes. It gave me a look of annoyance, and the one behind it now began to howl loudly. It echoed, making it even louder, hurting my ears. I ran from the scene, feeling disoriented and confused. It was the intensity of the vibration somehow. It was throwing me off. This was not going the way I had hoped it would all go. The manhole covers. I had to climb a ladder and get up to one of the manhole covers and get out of this place. I was crying like a baby and wishing my mother would rescue me. But this was something I had to get myself out of or perish trying. I climbed that ladder very slowly at first. It was not as easy to climb as my mother's ladder at home. I looked behind and saw the werewolves emerging from the other tunnel into this one, regarding me curiously. I couldn't control myself. My crying grew louder. This was a full-on baby wah kind of weeping. I was a ridiculous weakling when actually faced with real-life danger, as it turned out. We always imagine ourselves acting bravely like characters in movies or on TV, but you never know until there are two horribly smelly sewer dogmen chasing you up a ladder what your real character is made of. The smaller one had moved directly underneath me. If I slipped, I'd fall right on him. This, of course, made my hands sweaty and made it much harder to grip the ladder. It didn't appear that he knew how to climb the ladder, though, so I was going to make it free if I could just get the last way up and open that cover. I did make it the rest of the way up, but wow, that manhole cover was ridiculously heavy. It was made of wood, not metal as I had always assumed, but it was heavy nonetheless. I barely got one edge up, then I was furiously trying to slide the cover over enough that I could slip through. It was so hard to push that I was literally screaming. I was pushing so hard. I felt like my head was going to explode from the pressure, and my hands and arms ached. But I got that thing a sliver open and looked down to see the situation before I made my escape. The large dogman, fed up with the younger one taking no action, brushed him aside and began climbing the ladder behind me. Panicked, I stuck my head up out of that hole and discovered I was staring right at a car bearing down at me, about to drive right over my head. The driver's eyes widened as he began to understand the situation. He hit his brakes and swerved, stopping himself a few feet short of the hole. I slithered out of it, and the driver was already out of his car, already screaming and already lecturing me about how I almost gave him a bad driving record. I ran away. I knew what was coming next, and I wanted to get away before it happened. I was turning the corner before I heard the growling of the emerging dogman and the screaming of the lecturing driver. Sounded like Dogman didn't like his lecturing any more than I did. So the next day at school, at lunch, I was really excited to go tell my friends the entire story I just told you. I was really confused when I got to their table, and they all got up and moved to a different one. They called me Werewolf Boy and laughed at me. I told them I really saw the Dogman that they told me I would see, and the kid told me he just made that whole thing up to see how big an idiot I was. They thought I might be dumb enough to go walk out of town looking for the sewer entrance, but they didn't think I'd be so pathetic as to lie about actually seeing a mythical monster there, which everyone knew didn't exist. I was ostracized by all the kids in school as someone not only unintelligent, but also a big liar and attention seeker on top of it. Somehow I ended up having to have sessions with the school shrink, who would talk to me as though I were slow. If I expressed annoyance at that, then I was accused of excessive hostility. I couldn't wait to move again, and I knew it wouldn't take long, but for the remainder of the time I was trapped in that small town, I blamed all my troubles on the Dogman in the sewer. And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story. Buckle your safety belts and stay in your seat, because the funhouse ride is about to begin with a story we call Dark Ride Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a kid, my mother briefly dated a carny. Well, I mean, she dated him when he would pass through town. Then, One summer, she dragged me along with her as she traveled from town to town, trailing his carnival. I didn't mind going to the carnival every day, at first, but eventually even that gets dull. The air of danger around the show caused me to stray further and further into the surrounding woods until I discovered what real danger is when I walked onto the turf of the Dark Ride Dogman. I remember loving the fact that my mother was letting me roam around this park and that her boyfriend had gotten me a bunch of passes for most of the rides. It was the most independent I had been allowed to be up to that point. I thought at first that this meant my mother was gonna marry this carny, and I started to wonder what life would be like if she did. Could I cut it doing any of these jobs? I watched the workers and how they went about their business. If I had to survive in this environment as I grew up, which of these jobs could I do a good job at? I asked questions when people were on breaks. Some of them were suspicious of me and thought I was one kind of a spy or another. Others were eager to get to talk to somebody about their craft. Then there was the third type who would give you long, enthusiastic answers, which turned out to be utter hogwash, not an ounce of truth in their stories. So, there was one place the carnival moved to that was so far away from any towns that I couldn't understand why they were bothering to stop there. Mom booked us into the closest possible hotel, and yet we had to drive 45 minutes from there to reach the carnival. The location was not just next to a forest, but basically inside it. There were trees throughout the setup, which you had to walk around to get to the various attractions. As everything was getting built, I asked some of the workers who were friendlier if they expected much of a turnout in this area. The answer I got surprised me. This location had a patron. A very rich individual lived nearby, and he would pay the carnival to appear for a week so that the people of his village could see the show. Therefore, nobody who worked there was stressed over the size of the crowds. Everything was budgeted out in advance, and they would all be paid very well. As they set up the rides and attractions, the workers seemed in a happy mood, yet there was a weird undercurrent of foreboding, and I thought at the time that this was generated from the location itself. The place was foggy and misty, especially in the surrounding hills, but sometimes at night, even at the edges of the carnival itself. It was like someone overdid the fog machine in an old horror movie, but this was in real life. I was never in a place where you could only see like 90 feet around you and the rest was lost in the fog. The Ferris wheel operator was even barking that people should take the wheel to, quote, see above the fog, unquote. I guess he'd been through here before and he knew the drill. The place that first night was the emptiest I'd seen it, and the people from that area were kind of eccentric. They just had an odd look and feel about them, but I can't put my finger on exactly what it was. Any of them could have fit into a much larger crowd and not been noticed. It wasn't like they were the Addams family or something. It's just that they were all so much like each other. They all had similar ways of dressing and similar ways of saying things. Even the way they walked was like some choreographer had taught them all how to perform it precisely the same way. They all seemed out of another time also. This was the 1970s, and let's say they looked like the late 50s or early 60s basically. They were dressed casually, not wearing suits or anything, but they looked like they were wearing out-of-date casual clothing, if that makes any sense. For instance, most women and girls back then would wear jeans, usually bell-bottoms, to the carnival. These women tended to wear pedal pushers like Mary Tyler Moore on the Dick Van Dyke Show. I used my passes to get into the dark ride they had in that carnival. It was one of those where you sit in a train car and it goes into this shack filled with clowns and werewolves and witches and vampires that all pop out at you and go boo or whatever. That was always my favorite ride, and it never got old for me. I remember I had worked out a monster movie plot in my head from the ride. Instead of getting bored of the jump scares, my imaginary plot in my head helped me to get excited for the next one, and the next one. That night, however, riding the dark ride alone in that foggy, weird, lonely, empty place just sort of creeped me out. When I got out of there, I felt really cold. Not just chilly, but shivering cold. I gazed around at all the zombified people staggering everywhere, the carnies trying to get them to come to their booth and leave some cash behind. Instead of seeming exciting, everything just felt weird and dangerous. I guess I felt alienated from all the humans I was surrounded with, so I did what turned out to be a very foolish thing. I went behind the dark ride to hang out at the edge of the forest and be alone. If you're in the middle of nowhere, you never want to go off alone and not tell anyone where you were. Also, if you're in the middle of nowhere, you want to stay close to others of your kind, strength in numbers and all that. So, when I went behind the dark ride, then started strolling into the trees, enjoying the smells and sounds you can only smell and hear in the forest at night, I was breaking a number of common sense rules. I must have understood that even back then. Yet, I walked into the woods anyway, because I wanted to get away from that feeling of unease which had gripped me. Didn't work though, as the silent forest was just as creepy as the zombie carnival behind me. I leaned against a tree and sighed heavily, feeling sorry for myself as though my life was oh so bad. Then, suddenly, my life got a whole lot worse as I became aware of a growling sound. I looked in the direction of that sound, but only saw that stupid fog. Soon, I noticed 2 orange-yellow lights shining in the fog, too small to be flashlights, and moving in unison. That was eye shine, I realized. Eye shine, well above my line of vision, and moving toward me. I turned to get my bearings to run back to the carnival, but that fog enveloped everything. I could faintly hear the direction it was in, but I could not see it at all. I turned back toward the growling eye shine to see the fog part, and a very tall, dog-legged man walk right through the mist to appear in front of me, almost as though by dark magic. My eyes lifted off his back-bent legs, up to his glaring, glowing eyes. And I saw he wasn't just dog-legged. He was dog all over. I was running toward the sound of the carnival before I remember having the idea that that might be the thing to do. I could hear the big beast behind me. It was barking and growling and sounded angrier than I'd ever heard a dog sound. I was crying for my mother, probably literally. I don't really remember, but I'm sure I was a sight, because that dog man was close behind me, and I didn't even know how much further I had to run in the fog. Suddenly, I was there, at the back of the dark ride. I ran around the side of it into the carnival and relaxed a bit. I had made it back to civilization. I turned quickly to see if I could get one final glimpse of the Dogman. Instead, I got a full view of him as he hadn't stopped running toward me. I dove out of the way, and that Dogman ran past me, right out into the middle of the main walkway of the carnival, then stopped. It stood there and looked around. I thought that once he realized where he was, he would turn around and beat a hasty retreat to the forest. Except he just kept standing there and looking around, as though considering his options. I looked around too. There really weren't that many people there. Some of them hadn't even noticed the Dogman standing there yet. The others didn't seem too panicked about it. On a normal night, the Dogman would likely have already left, but on that night, in that location, I think he was doing the math in his head. Then, my blood ran cold as I heard the sound of a very large dog or wolf in the woods behind me, howling. The Dogman quickly turned his attention to it as well. Was he going to howl back? Was he going to draw others of his kind here to make mincemeat of the strange locals, and me as well? I held my breath and frantically looked around for possible hiding places. How many Dogmen would he be calling in? What hiding spot would provide me with my greatest chance to survive? And then, just like that, the Dogman silently ran behind the dark house, presumably to join his companion in the woods. I went and hung out with the Ferris wheel operator the rest of the night, as far from the dark house as I could get. I had been lucky to survive what just happened to me, and I never again wanted to risk encountering the dark ride Dogman.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.